Well, good morning, everyone, all the quilters out there from home or wherever you are. My name is Sharon Blackmore, and I'm excited to be back with you for another Facebook Live. We really hope that you've been enjoying all of the videos that you've been seeing over the last couple of weeks. I know for me personally, I learned something new with every video that was shared. So, and I have to catch my breath. Getting ready for these videos can sometimes be a little bit crazy and harried because we run through everything. We kind of do a dry run before we go live. Tools and things that we've got to get ready for you. Stuffing dog treats into dog toys and putting them away somewhere so that they won't make noise, that kind of thing. And that's exactly what I just finished doing. So, but they are a lot of fun. Like I said, I learned something different with every video that's been shared. And I'm sure that if I went back and watched them again, which I highly encourage you to do, you will be able to pick up more tips, just like kind of watching a movie over more than once. You definitely pick up different kinds of things. So before we get started, first of all, I wanted to give a shout out to all of our unsung heroes that are holding the cameras for us. So on the other side of that lens back there, my husband Jason is holding the camera for me today. And I know that all of the other educators, that these Facebook Live videos have not been brought to you without a little bit of help from a family member. So I wanted to thank all of you and to my man back there for helping us out and supporting us and helping us get this information out to each one of you at home. So this little video is going to be a few little things kind of mashed together. More helpful backing tips for you. The first Facebook Live that I did was about how to square up an extra large quilt backing. And we went through the process of how to find a square, how to trim it. But there was a lot of questions in the comments after the fact, after the video, about what to do with the other side. And although we went back and tried to make sure that everybody got answered, we thought it might be valuable for some of you to see what we do with the other side, because you don't always have to square both sides. So I think we probably got a few people watching now that we can get rolling. Okay, so first a little bit about extra wide backs. Extra wide backs, they're 108, sometimes 120 inches from salvage to salvage. And just as something that you can keep in mind, that extra wide fabric is folded twice on the bolt, so it often doesn't come off the bolt very square, at least not as square as a 40-inch or 44-inch wide fabric would be. So when we're backing to be bigger than the quilt top, I used to ask for 6 inches, which was 3 inches on each side, totaling 6 inches larger than the quilt top overall. But for extra wide backings, I always ask for at least 10 inches larger than the quilt top. And here's the reason, and this was one of the other questions about how to deal with the squaring and what to do with the other side, the question was, can we snip and rip? And you absolutely can. And what I did with several wide backs is I did a bit of experiment, and I took a bunch of wide backs and I did a snip and rip test. What I found was that on average, well, I shouldn't say on average, the most I was out, and there's probably worse out there, but the most I was out in my little test, and it was about 6 backings, I believe, was about 4 inches. So I took that 4 inches. So what that means is, I'll back up for a second. What that means is if I did a snip here and I ripped towards that end, the width of that piece of fabric might be 1 inch down here, but it might be 4 inches down at the other end. And so what can happen when you're doing your snip and rip is if you don't put even pressure on both sides of the fabric, and sometimes that's hard to do depending on how wide that strip is that you've cut. If you don't put even pressure on both sides, sometimes that line can kind of move over a little bit on you and tear more uneven. So you just have to be a little bit careful with that. So that 4 inches that the backings were out on average, the 4 inches I took and added that to my original 6 inches that I was asking for, and that gives me 10. So that's why we ask for 10 inches larger overall than the quilt top for extra wide backings. That just gives you a little bit of grace, a little bit of room to play with. If that big backing is really out of square, again, you can ask for more if you'd like to, but I wouldn't want less than 10 inches to work with. Those extra backings, when they get taken off the bolt and unfolded, they're like a parallelogram. They're quite crooked. So it's a good topic, and there's always lots of questions on it. So let's move ahead and talk about what we're going to do with this big piece of backing. This is the exact same piece of fabric that we squared 2 weeks ago, and it's time to quilt this quilt today. So we're gonna keep the backing on, and we're gonna load the rest of the quilt. Not in this video, but we'll carry on with it this time. And so you know that this end right here is the end that I squared in that last video. So I have it attached to my backing leader. And over in the corner here, you can see that I've used my side clamps as an extra pair of hands. And they just hold on to the side of the leader so that it doesn't slip down around the bar, because this is a slippery surface here, this roller bar. And Andrew Weaver shared in a previous video that the angle of this strap is important. If you have the angle this way, it's more likely to kind of slip down. And so it's a good tip to put the angle of that strap a little bit further back, and it helps keep it more secure and taut. So your method for attaching the fabric to the leader, there isn't really a right or wrong way. Some people use a clamping system, and some people still pin. That's totally okay. You've got to do whatever works for you. Once you've got the fabric attached to the leaders, as you can see, I have it draped all the way over the pickup bar here. So I'm going to scooch around to the other side. And this piece of backing is touching the floor. You can't see it from over there, but it's touching the floor. And so what you want to make sure is that the backing is evenly draped over top of the pickup bar here and across the edge of the table. And if it's a really, really big backing that's, you know, piling up on the floor, you want to try to pool the bulk of that fabric evenly across, because what we're going to do is we're going to allow this fabric to self-level as we load it onto this frame here. So if you wouldn't mind, hun, just loosen that clamp off that side. Awesome, thank you. So we're ready to start. I'm going to come down to this end, and I'm going to start to roll up the backing bar. And I'll just keep this one from moving. And if you look at the fabric that's rolling across this bar here, this canvas leader is kind of got a grip to it, and so it helps keep the fabric nice and taut as it's floating across it, and helps it keep it fairly square. Now let's take a quick look in the center here, what's happening. This happens sometimes, and I don't want to try and scooch past this. Can you see there's a little bit of a wrinkle here, a little bit of a peak, a little bit of a gather? So what can happen is it can gather in the center, especially if, and I can see by this backing because there's a crease right here, if this was where the fabric was folded previously, it naturally kind of wants to fold again. And so if you start to see this happening while you're doing this process, what I do is come right to the middle, and I put my hand down right in the middle of that spot. Keep my left hand there, and with my right hand, I can just smooth it out. And then I'll come back to the center and put my other hand there and do the same thing on the opposite side. So smoothing from the center out. So now that little bit of gather is gone, and we can carry on. So we're going to roll this until the fabric comes up off the floor and onto the table. And I'm going to invite my hubby to scooch around the other side of the table so you guys can get a visual of what's going on back here on this side of the frame. awesome. So now you can see that the backing has the table or off the edge of the table, and it's just sitting nice and flat here. So my pickup leader is right here underneath. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to roll this onto the backing bar until, see the position I've got this pickup, until the shortest edge of this whole length of fabric, the shortest edge, which is right here, is maybe at most an inch away from the edge of the leader. Okay, so if we can get a good look, you can see down here, there's the leader underneath, there's the leader underneath. Look at what a difference there is from one side to the other. This is the end that we did not square, okay? The other end we squared, not this one. Once that short edge is right at the edge, I'm gonna bring my pickup bar forward just like so. And what we wanna look for, if you can pan down inside here, so you wanna look for kind of an even cradle happening in the inside. If the fabric inside here is touching the rail, if it's touching this rail underneath, under the track, then you want to tighten up your backing bar just a little bit so it's not touching anything underneath at all. And we have a nice even drape here. So this is really just like when we squared the fabric and we folded it in half and we shifted it from side to side to get that nice even swoop underneath. That's all we're looking for here. And in real life, this quilt would be probably already basted and ready to go. So you can really get quick with this process. It's very fast because once you have one side squared, the other one is just a piece of cake to do with this method. So what I like to do at this point is go in and you can use pins. If you're a pinner, you would pin right here. You could use the pins and you're going to go all the way across and pin, and we're not going to straighten this out, okay? I want to show you though what happens if we try to fix this fabric, because I've seen a lot of times that people will want to naturally straighten that edge out. And so let's just do a little experiment and see what happens if I try to do that. I'll tighten up the backing bar a little bit so you can see what happens on the inside. So let's say I'm like, oh, I've got to have this even here. So that there, and I want to make that all nice and even inside. So what happened? This is even out here, but what happened on the inside? Look at how much shorter, how much less fabric there is here. And if you look down at that end, you can see how deep that gape is down there. And that's not what we want to see. We want to see a nice even drape across that side. So if you do that by accident, here's how you fix it. It's not a big deal. All you've got to do is pull that back out until you see that nice even drape again inside the frame. Okay. So again, you'll go in, and I like to, if you pin, this is where you would maybe pin in the center, and you put a pin on either end. Or if you use a clamping system, you can do that too. The reason I like to do that is because I don't want this roller bar, this pickup bar, rolling forward and then all my fabric fall down and then I have to start all over again. So, I'm going to go in and replace the little clamps with larger ones. And if you're curious, these are called leader grips. And if you check with your local gamble dealer, you could probably get your hands on a set. Okay. So once those are on, then I can drop this forward into the frame. And if you would like to go back around to the other end, he's so good at taking orders. All right, so now this is dropped forward, and now we can tighten up the slack in the backing bar. So isn't that amazing? Look at how short it is over here and how much extra fabric there is over there. You need to resist the temptation to straighten that out, okay? So now that we have our backing loaded, and if you have questions on that at all, if there was anything that was unclear, please just go ahead and type it in the comments and I'll make sure to follow up with you afterwards. It's difficult to read questions and answer them while you're doing these, so thanks for understanding. So now we have our backing ready and loaded. And another really great question that is asked often is how tight should our backing be inside the frame? So for me, because when I first started quilting, I didn't have a long arm and I was quilting small projects on my domestic sewing machine at home. For me, it makes sense that if you think about the quilt sandwich that you have when you're domestic machine quilting, you can't put any tension on that backing at all, right? It's in its relaxed state and there's no distortion at all with it. And it just moves around underneath the needle, right? I kind of like to try to think of this backing loaded on this frame in the same way that I want to quilt this quilt and the backing in a relaxed state so that when I take it off the frame, there's no weird distortions or wobbles or puckers anywhere at all. So that's what I try to keep in mind, is how much tension would be on the quilt sandwich if I was using my domestic machine. And so I really try not to over tighten. It's really easy to do. Sometimes we think we've got to just crank that right up. And that's one of the things I love about the Gamble frame is with the ratchet and pin system here, wherever you tighten it, it stays. It's secure and it's solid until you move it again. So if you tighten it too much, here's what can happen. It's a struggle for your machine to move through that fabric because what's happening is it tightens it up so much that, let's give you two examples. The first one would be, we've got our batting here and then our top on top of the backing, and when our machine is stitching, we need a place for that stitch to form. So if our backing is really stretched too tight, often what happens is that stitch could form on the back of the quilt and it may look like you have a tension problem. So then what happens? We go to our dials and we start turning knobs and crossing our fingers and saying a prayer and hoping that it's all gonna, fix, and it doesn't help. It's a deception, it's an illusion. Sometimes it's just your backing is too tight, and it can be especially so with fabrics like batiks where the thread count is so much higher. The other thing that can happen with the backing that's too tight is the needle will struggle to go through it smoothly. So we'll get a bit of needle flexion or deflection. You've heard that term, I'm sure. And so the needle will sometimes bend or flex slightly against that really, really tight fabric. That can cause stitch quality problems as well. Again, we think that maybe there's a knob that needs to be adjusted on our machine and we start playing and then things get really, really out of whack. So really the backing, to me it's a big deal because it's the foundation of everything else that you're going to do. You want to set yourself up for success by getting that backing loaded square and not too tight the first time. So one of the things that I've seen people suggest is this kind of pinch test. And they'll say you should be able to pick up, or if you put your finger underneath here, you should be able to pick that up. Now that's not a bad rule, but even if I really tighten this up, this is tighter than I would ever go. Even if I really tighten that up, I can still put my finger there and I can still grab that fabric. So you need to find the spot that's right for you. But the easiest way to think about it is to have that backing that quilt quilted with the backing in a relaxed state, so that there's no weird stuff that happens when you take it off the frame. I like to see a little bit of movement across my fabric. Here's another thing that you can do, is if you tap your hand, even this is a little bit too tight. I like to see a bit of a wave kind of travel when I tap my hand, and the fabric just kind of ripples and bounces a little bit. If it's like a tight drum and you bounce it and that fabric doesn't move at all, you've probably got your backing too tight. So definitely want to just take a look at that. The other thing that can come into play is how tight we make the backing in the opposite direction. So the pickup bar and the backing bar are holding the quilt back in place for us here. And that's actually a really good way to think about it. It's not stretching your quilt. Don't think about it that way. Think about it, they're just holding the backing in place for you so that you can do your quilting. So the side tension is important as well. And so your side clamps will be attached just like so. There's a little bit of a ripple here, a little bit of a wave there. Hopefully you can, does that show well on the camera? And so really we're just going to put enough tension that goes away. If we start to see this happen, that's way too much side tension. You can see how it's just stretched. You can actually see, or I can from where I am standing, I can see how stretched that fabric is. When I relax that off, all I want to do is make sure that when my machine, here's my needle, when I'm traveling over here and then I travel back into the quilt, that the whole sandwich isn't going to come back with it. You're not using these side clamps to really put any stretch into the backing. Again, they're just holding the backing stationary and in place, so it's not moving around while you're doing your quilting. So I hope that is a way that makes sense to you. Now, I think we may have touched on this before, but in the first video about squaring the backing, because we did talk about length and crosswise grain, but I know there were some questions in the comments regarding which grain you want to have running parallel to your bars. And really with this method of loading and with not over tightening your clamps, it's not going to matter if you put the lengthwise grain or the crosswise grain running parallel to your bars, as long as you don't over tighten. Just remember which grain you're using, and remember that you're going to have more stretch. Right here's my selvage. You can see that selvage edge. There's going to be more stretch this way, because this is the cross grain, than there is going to be in this direction, because this is the lengthwise grain. So that's just something that you can keep in mind. If you know what direction your fabric is loaded, then it'll be a little bit easier for you to go, okay, my crosswise grain is right here. I don't want to put too much side tension on there at all. Okay, so here's the very last thing I want to share with you today. I've done this so many times. I get my backing loaded and I completely forget to measure it. I need a sip of water. Give me 1 second. Talking this much makes you thirsty. So measuring your backing. I forget to do that all the time. And then I think, oh, I've got to take this whole thing off and measure it, because we know we can measure it this way, but how would we measure it this way? So maybe this isn't a new tip for you guys, but if it is for a couple people, then that makes me happy. So I take my 120-inch measuring tape, and you can see there's a few holes in there because I've done this a couple times. And I just take and pin it in place right here at the top. Doesn't have to be fancy as long as it stays in place. And then I'm going to open up my tape all the way, and I'm going to let it sit on the floor right in front of me, like so, nice and straight off of the backup bar, or the backing bar, the backup bar I called it. So now I'm going to roll this all the way up, and look, we're measuring as we go. And there is our measurement. So if you've got your quilt top out already and you're ready to put your backing, your top on, and you've realized, I better double check the measurement of this backing because maybe it's not quite right. That's a really, really simple way to just quickly check. And then you just have to roll it back the other way and of course take this off. So I hope that was a helpful tip. So if you have any more questions, like I said, if you've got questions or comments, please go ahead and post them. That's what we're here for. We're happy to chat with you. You can go ahead and put a comment or a question in the comment section on the video. And if you're curious about the previous video, I believe it was called How to Square a Large Quilt Back. And if you go into the video section on the Gammo page, you can look at all the previous videos. For those of you who haven't joined us right from the beginning of the Facebook Live videos, you can go right back to the beginning and watch them. You can re-watch them. Just because they're live doesn't mean you can't watch them later, and that's the beauty of that whole live. So speaking of live videos, we've got another one at 3 p.m. Central Time today, and every day at 10:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. Central Time. I have to keep remembering that because I'm an hour earlier than Central Time. I'm Mountain Standard Time, so for me it's an hour before you guys. So you guys are probably just up having your coffee and I'm almost at lunchtime. So anyways, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. And actually that was the other way around. You guys are halfway through your morning. We just had our breakfast. That was the opposite. Sorry about that. So again, we'll see you again for the next Facebook Live. Thank you so much for watching and have a fantastic day.